Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of No More Silos. My name is Erika and this is my podcast. Hey everybody, welcome. It is absolutely my pleasure to join you once again. We are talking about this month deconstructing language to reconstruct our faith. And this has been kind of an ongoing conversation, and I have been kind of bouncing some of the ideas off on deconstructing language in our Bible study and in conversations I've had with friends as I'm recording. This is post Labor Day weekend, so I've had a bunch of barbecues to go to and hangouts with friends and family, and of course church on Sunday. And it's interesting because at some point I think we all realize the impact of language on our lives and our beliefs. We've been studying the Sermon on the Mount in Bible study, and it is the great deconstruction treatise. Like Jesus is like, you've heard it said this way, but what we really meant was this, and here's how I want you to think about it. So it's language deconstructing our beliefs, our theology, which is what we think about God, is informed by the words that shape our outlook on life. And as I think about my love for books and words and connecting the dots with words through books, I realize the tremendous power of language in deconstructing and reconstructing one's faith as a Christian. And our language, it reflects our culture. We've heard it said a lot in the past few years that Black American or African American culture influences everything. It's occurred to me, though, that we're not influencing the church all the time the way that we think we are. I mean, yes, there are church influencers and they're in their lane, but what and yes, we are asking questions about church hurt, and we're asking questions about misogyny and misogynoir and toxic masculinity. We're asking those questions. We're asking the questions about the so-called white man's religion. More books are coming out that are addressing this. And like urban apologetics, and Dr. Sarita Lyons just came out with a book, Church Girl. We are asking the questions, but and we're even doing the scholarly work to show that Christianity was in sub-Saharan Africa well before the European colonial slave trading age of discovery. But our theology of the cross and the lynching tree has been rejected in large part in mainstream academics. Our theology of freedom and overcoming oppression is viewed academically as not up to par to the European theological standards. So a lot of what we read and access as theology or understanding systematic theology is not filtered through our experience, but rather through the European experience, the same standard that allowed Christians to enslave other Christians and people in general in the most inhumane way. So in some ways, it can still be problematic. And because of that, there are still long-held beliefs that kind of get glossed over in a lot of conversations because we just haven't really dealt with them yet. And I've been trying to here on No More Silos. That's why we're talking about language, because I really, really want you to ask the questions about the words that we use. There's still a significant impact and influence that seminaries across the various denominations are largely not teaching liberation theology in a mainstream theology course. It's like an elective or a lane that students can focus on in some of the more progressive schools, but it is not something that people are being taught as all the time as, hey, here are these different main theological avenues that people are on, and depending upon the perspective of where your culture and where you're coming from in this, your position, you may see it differently than others. Like having that conversation is not happening enough. And so language let's give you a definition for language, because I think we are now 4 parts into this series, and I don't know that I've given you a definition per se, if you were taking notes and listening to this with your small group. Language is a structured system of communication consisting of sounds, words, and grammar that allows humans to express thoughts, ideas, emotions, and information. It is a symbolic medium through which individuals interact, share knowledge, and convey meaning, playing a critical role in the social and the cognitive development of societies. And as we've been talking, language and culture are deeply intertwined. As we talked about the book Mother Tongue a few weeks back, it is the English language goes back 900, 1100 years, and the changes and nuances that happened in culture were reflected in language, and then language caused culture to change. And we're finding that even now, culture influences and shapes language. Culture provides the context in which language develops, determining the vocabulary, the expressions and meanings that reflect a community's values, a community's beliefs, our community's practices, our orthopraxy and our orthodoxy. For instance, languages often have words or phrases unique to specific cultural experiences, illustrating how language captures the nuances of a society's way of life. But the flip side of that, conversely, language influences culture by framing how people perceive the world and interact with it. The linguistic structures and categories within a language can shape thought processes and social interactions, reinforcing cultural norms and ideologies. That's why last time we talked about that quote from Sheila Wray Gregoire's site from her book, She Deserves Better. A lot of times people in healthy marriages don't realize the language they're using is the same language that justifies abuse. And we don't change our language, and we keep promoting books that are problematic. We keep promoting people who are problematic and unhinged or lack self-control. And then we say, oh, yeah, well, not quite like that. We make excuses for them. How about we just not have to make excuses? How about we, instead of reinforcing these bad cultural norms, we evolve and we allow our language to evolve and adapt new realities as we adapt to new technologies and social dynamics. And this reciprocal relationship highlights how language is not just a tool for communication, but also a key component in the transmission and preservation of a cultural identity. So, having said all that, African American theology has profoundly influenced language and customs in the American church, shaping both worship practices and theological discourse. Rooted in the experiences of slavery, segregation, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights, African American theology emphasizes themes of liberation, justice, and hope. This theological tradition has enriched the American church with a unique vocabulary of resistance and resilience, often passed through powerful preaching, gospel music, and communal worship that centers on the lived experiences of African Americans and people of color. And I think that's really key, because that's what's different. It's not just what we read in a book. It's not just what someone passed down, but it is the lived experiences. And the challenge the church has today with connecting with folks is that the lived experience of the most recent generations does not include actually going to church. And so as we are deconstructing our language to reconstruct our faith, we have to take into consideration that the lived experiences of the generations that are of the younger generations may not include actually having participated in communal worship, but rather let me pause here for a second. I saw this statistic yesterday. They were talking about how in the African American church world, more people are watching church online, like going to church, physically going to church is just, since COVID, it's really, really become less and less of a thing. And as churches of different sizes make the justification for the cost value of an effort and volunteer value in setting up online services. Is it online and on demand, or is it live streamed? And what are you getting if you live stream? And then the people who are online, are they ever going to come to your church? Are they giving to your church? Or are they just consuming your church, your sermons, the information that's there? All of this, though, is a theological perspective, even in spite of these stats, in spite of what's there. And so when I think about, like, how are we connecting the dots for folks? I'm always repeating the idea, the mantra has almost become in our church, salvation is a community creating event. Because in terms of language, our theology has introduced expressions and idioms that reflect the community's journey from oppression to spiritual freedom. Phrases like "let my people go" and "we shall overcome" resonate deeply, not only as biblical allusions, but also as affirmations of faith in the face of adversity. And the call and response style in preaching, a hallmark of African American worship, has also permeated the broader Christian practices. You have people of all shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds doing call and response in their sermon. You go, there's some churches you go, nobody's talking back to the preacher. But then here in the South, I see that much more frequently. I see even video clips on TikTok or Reels on Instagram where the preacher is not Black, but you hear the crowd answering him back. He's asking rhetorical questions, but he's really expecting the people in the congregation to participate communally, to embrace this dynamic interaction between the preacher and the congregation. It's like it's become very much expected. So customs within the American church, such as vibrant and expressive worship, have been shaped by African American traditions, particularly the use of music as a form of theological expression. Gospel music, spirituals, hymns, composed by African American artists convey theological truths with emotional depth and cultural specificity that influences worship across denominations. But y'all have heard me say this before. It's like nails on a chalkboard, although that's a reference that only Gen X and older would recognize because everybody's got whiteboards now. But this idea that when I listen to gospel music and I realize the more I study God's word, how some of it doesn't actually align with the language of the Bible, but aligns more with the language of culture. And so then you're scratching your head going, where's the truth in the midst of that? Because there's this emphasis on social justice and community care within the African American theology that also has led to the integration of activism with faith, encouraging churches to address societal issues through a biblical lens. But what we've seen in the last generations, that there is a disconnection with activism and the church. The church has become in large part complacent in their place in society and not going out into the streets, going out into the culture. And that's a generational divide. And that's not really what I'm up for debate on today. But I do think it is part and parcel to the deconstruction and reconstruction of language, because overall, African American theology has significantly impacted the language and customs of the church, enriching the theological vocabulary, worship practices, and commitment to social justice. But what we're finding today, that social justice a lot of times is something that is completely disconnected from the church. And our language is beginning to reflect that, even with the older vestiges of language from the civil rights movement in the 60s. So, but here's where I don't think we've carved out our own lane theologically, but instead absorbed the dominant culture's oppressive views. And that's in the theology of gender and relationships. Black and other minority-led churches are very much complementarian leaning without using that word. Like, they don't use that word. I've said it a number of times. When I say complementarian in a lot of the circles I roll in, it's like, what is that? What is egalitarian? What is complementary? I've never heard those words before. You don't even hear it used because we have embraced so much the language of oppression when it comes to gender that we don't even realize that's what we've done. For example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we accepted the purity culture theology as it seemed to align with our conservative views as African Americans. Of course, we wanted our teens to wait and engage in adult activities before marriage. We wanted them to wait for marriage. But depending on the church, you might have also received a balanced, but here's what birth control looks like kind of talk too, or not. We bought all the purity culture books. You may have heard of some of them. Every Man's Battle. It was popular for men's ministry book studies addressing porn and lust, but somehow made the problem out to be the clothes that the girls and women were wearing. So instead of saying, hey, guy, have some self-control. Hey, guy, what did Jesus actually say in the Sermon on the Mount when it came to lust? That it's an internal thing. You've done this with your mind, with your heart, before you even ever say anything or do anything. And then we make this assumption that all Christian men are struggling in this way, when that's not even true. There are plenty of guys out there who don't have a problem with lust, and there's plenty of women out there who do. So we got that book. That book was out there. It's kind of toxic. Then there's the For Men Only and For Women Only, and books that were written by people who weren't qualified to write the books. And so there's that. And then there's Real Marriage, which also is toxic. Love and Respect with their chairs analogy. Go look that one up. It's kind of crazy. And then there's I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And the guy who wrote that actually isn't even a Christian anymore. He denounced Christianity a decade or two later, because we were sold this theology, faulty theology. We filled our megachurch bookstores with the same books and faulty theology of the prosperity/purity cultural movement. And we wrote a few of our own books too. Also with poor exegesis and theology. Remember No More Sheets? That whole thing set off a thing with women throwing out. Anyway, I digress. Overall, it seemed, at least from my perspective and experience in Black church culture, that we just didn't question the books and the resources. And if we wrote our own, we used those other books as a primary source. Large churches didn't encourage young ministers to go to academically accredited or challenging seminaries, but instead created their own ministry schools within the church. I can't tell you how many times I've looked up people's bios and it'll mention some random school, and I look up the school and it's some pastor's specific ministry school. And I'm not knocking in general that you could have your own internal ministry school. I think that's a good idea. You should be training people in your church, in your community, in your congregation. However, when it's the blind leading the blind, for example, a friend of mine sent me a link to a school that was actually an online school based in South Korea, I think. And her friend, my friend's friend, was considering going there because she really wanted to be more in depth in her Bible study. And I'm sitting there going, all the seminaries and continuing ed programs that teach Bible in the United States, and she found this one that looks like a cult from South Korea someplace. It was just really, When I went to the website, I looked at it and I was like, they had a very specific theology. The first red flag for me was they said they only use the Bible as their teaching tool. Their classes and lectures were 2 hours long. And I'm sitting there going, that seems problematic off the rip. And so when someone actually did go to seminary, then they had to deconstruct everything that they knew or thought they knew, because they had been repeatedly told all of these things that turned out to not actually be in the Bible at all. So anyway, that brings me to where we are today with toxic masculinity and identifying a way forward in our churches and communities. And so I want to kind of focus today on what does that way forward look like? We've got to answer some questions like, where do some of these ideas come from? But as we've been talking about that, I also want to point out that I'm increasingly seeing more and more young men of color gain access to tools to properly exegete the scriptures. And they're making the TikToks and Reels, realizing that they've been sold a false gospel and, things that a lot of women have known for years and have said as much. But I'm seeing more and more people working together to create a path forward, to heal from church hurt, to heal from the toxic masculinity and to heal from the problems that we don't realize we're bringing into our relationships, the baggage that we're bringing into our relationships because we've had poor theology taught to us in the past. And that once we're reading it on our own, we're realizing, oh, that's what's going on. And I say this from time to time. I went to seminary when I realized no one around me had the answers I was looking for at the beginning of my deconstruction journey. Now, I help other people with their deconstruction journeys because I realized that everybody's got their spiritual path that they've got to walk through with the ultimate goal of becoming more and more like Jesus. But for every hopeful video I see, there are 5 others spouting off why women shouldn't have authority over men and wives should submit to their husbands. And I watched a YouTube video of a podcast one day with a husband and wife that are well known as a ministry couple. And actually, I've seen variations of this with a few different married couples and video podcasts where the husband is talking about wives submit to your husbands and how that works or doesn't work in their relationship. And the wife is trying really hard not to make a face that demonstrates her disagreement or lack of agreement with that statement. But still at the same time, they're saying things like, again, with this language, I tried to forcefully get my wife to submit to my leadership when we first got married. It didn't work. And then they list a few reasons, including her personality or life as a leader in her own right prior to marrying him. And this is actually one of the reasons my husband and I have not been able to launch our marriage podcast yet, because I can't hold my facial expressions together if we disagree. And so, yeah, so there's that. So LOL on that one. This is usually where I see this theology breakdown, especially with Black couples who marry later in their 20s or 30s when both of them have already have established careers. And so I think in my next episode, I may provide some commentary on one such video that I watched episode. I won't say the name of the famous couple because honestly, it's not about, my commentary is really not about them per se, because they're not the only ones that I've seen online sharing their views on relationships, and then kind of you're watching in real time how they are deconstructing and reconstructing and realizing, oh, I thought this was going to work, but then real life happened and I realized that's not really how we can function. And I see this all the time with couples that I'm coaching. In fact, here's a thought. 25 years ago, maybe longer than that, Essence magazine ran an article that voiced a concern that we're now seeing echoed in the wider spectrum of American culture. In fact, I believe it's reached a tipping point. And I'm seeing on social media now men being called to task on the video gaming self-centered culture of not having any goals or ambitions. In fact, the book Fighting Shadows addresses that in large part. And what do I mean by that? Well, churches are calling young men to get married, right? That's American Christian culture. Yes, you should get married. Your end goal is marriage, right? But the problem that we're running into is that the guys have not been socialized or trained to be marriage materials. So they don't really have a good working definition of what a wife is, what a partner is. And so the women are looking for someone to be a life partner because that's biblical. And men are looking for a helpmeet. And this is the problem we have with language. We've set this expectation that your wife is going to behave like your mom. And then when she doesn't, we have problems. So where did this idea come from? It came from the purity culture movement back in the 90s and early 2000s. The definition that Zachary Wagner uses in his book is purity culture refers to the theological assumptions, discipleship materials, events, and rhetorical strategies used to promote traditional Christian sexual ethics in response to the sexual revolution. And so the key thing of note here is that as we effectively look back on this time, is that it was a response to the sexual revolution of like the 60s and 70s. Not a return or a repenting towards biblical values as it was promoted, but it was actually just a response to a major cultural shift in America that included wins for independence and autonomy for women, like getting a credit card or access to abortion or continuing to work while pregnant. Did you know that just a couple of generations ago, if you got pregnant, your boss could fire you? Or you couldn't have a credit card without your husband? I mean, they just had celebrated the 50th anniversary of women being able to get a credit card in their own name the other day. By the 1980s, women had the freedom to make choices about staying or not staying in an abusive relationship. And I want to also point out here that historically, this has ebbed and flowed. Culturally, this has ebbed and flowed. This is where language is a big indicator on culture, because just because we're celebrating 50 years of this doesn't mean that this is universal around the world, and it doesn't mean that it was that women in all time before the 1950s had or didn't have access. And so I want to make sure that that is clear, because sometimes people think, oh, well, these traditional roles. Well, no, we're talking about stuff that's post-World War II, and then it changed. People didn't like it, and so then they responded 20 years later. So every documentary on Hulu and Netflix and Amazon that details the crazy, oppressive, fake Christian cults of the 1980s and 90s includes a story of at least one or more women who stayed in an abusive relationship because the church leaders told them they couldn't divorce. And this is how we got the Council of Biblical Manhood and Womanhood and the ESV translation of the Bible. This is how we suddenly had more princess theology than we could shake a stick at. Someday my prince will come, and he will be a handsome, noble Christian man who I can follow, because he will be the spiritual leader in our home. And this is the time that the theology of male headship takes on a greater prominence. And lots can be said about what's wrong, but let's start talking about what can go right. Zachary Wagner's book on non-toxic masculinity makes this powerful suggestion. He says they, talking about men, should leverage their embodied male advantage for the well-being of others, not preservation of power or self-seeking ends. They should leverage their embodied male advantage. I want to talk about the embodied male advantage for a second here. We're talking about the physicality, the biological differences that even in the Bible are observed, recognized, but also it's not condoned that your embodied male advantage is not used for the well-being of others. It's not preservation of power. It's not self-seeking. Jesus even comments on this. And so healthy expressions of male sexuality, according to Wagner, embrace this reality that toxic expressions of male sexuality deny it or avoid it. And so what we see in these Christian books and resources and their teachings on sex too often say almost nothing about fatherhood. So let me back up here for a moment. They say almost nothing about fatherhood. So one of the arguments that Wagner makes in his book is that we limit men and male sexuality to just an act that they do with their body, as opposed to what happens when that happens. You could become a father, which is something we automatically assume with women. It's weird. It's like this complete cognitive dissonance that's going on. So finding a path forward says that we have to look at what a healthy expression of male sexuality is supposed to be. Because when we don't focus or don't include fatherhood, it's a disservice to families and children because it's an incomplete understanding of male sexuality. And boys must learn to see their sexuality in terms of the calling of fatherhood, not just about pleasure or fulfillment that could lead to a deeper connection in relationships, and that relationships lead to new life opportunities. But the limitation and responsibility that's too often in the Christian context and society in general that women carry, it becomes an unfair share of the responsibility associated with human sexuality. And this should not be the case. So it's like, what does growing up really look like? So who is Wagner? Wagner's an ordained minister. He's the editorial director of the Center for Pastor Theologians, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in the New Testament. Why is that important to me? Well, it's important, one, because I like reading scholarly work, but two, because he grew up in that purity culture world, and he believed all that stuff until he got married and it didn't work. And then he was looking around going, okay, here I am, a minister of the gospel. This is what I've believed all the time. Maybe I need to go and question some of the things that I believe. And he did the homework and he did the research. And he realized that non-toxic masculinity is not a matter of following rules or maintaining sexual purity or avoiding sexual sin, but it's about growing up. It's about self-control. He says, unfortunately, Christian men especially, have been sold this idea that if you stick with Jesus and follow all the biblical rules, it's going to lead to the best sex in your life when you get married. And actually, that's not what God has promised us. I mean, it's not that won't happen, but too much emphasis has been made on that. And I notice that sometimes when I talk to young couples in pre-marriage coaching, I get we get to the part of the SIMMUS assessment where it talks about, what you imagine your sex life to be, assuming that the couple has been abstinent in their relationship. But even if they haven't, it's, there's that. And I've coached couples where that was not the case as well. And it's interesting because you get the ones who are abstinent and they say things like, oh yeah, we're going to do it every day. And I'm like, uh-huh. And how does every day look when biology shows up, when work stress shows up, when kids show up? And then what Wagner says in his book, he's like, we have to look at the Christian life that's actually in the New Testament, which is one of self-denial, not self-fulfillment. We have to move beyond this subcultural sickness that Christian men need to embrace, giving up their sense of entitlement. Giving up their sense of entitlement. Because women kind of get it. It's like, something clicks when you have kids and you realize, oh my gosh, there's some things I just can't do anymore. I have to make sure I take care of this baby. We don't socialize men the same way. Something kicks in on autopilot with women biologically when you have your monthly cycle and okay, for a week, I'm probably not going to be doing much. But would you believe, because many of you probably haven't read some of these toxic books that I've been telling you about, and I hope you never have to, but you may hear people quote from them from time to time, that they reference things in there like telling women that they have to find a different way to satisfy their spouse when they're not available because of biological reasons. It's crazy. It's nuts. It really is. And you sit there and you're like, wow, people really believe that? Yes. And then you wonder why your friend doesn't want to go to church anymore. Because they heard that. Going forward, I think the language of deconstruction that helps us reconstruct is that the idea of embodied strength, because it is that biological difference. If, for example, in the Fighting Shadows book, the author writes, you cannot reduce your vision of manhood to biology. I think that's an important detail. You cannot reduce your vision of manhood to biology. Again, the language that we're using. because it's insufficient to give you the clarity you need to move forward. And we can't let ideology, again, language, define our view of manhood or womanhood, because that is the language. The language is the words we use to share that ideology. And then that becomes problematic. I want to share one of the things that echoes that article from Essence that was shared in Fighting Shadows. They actually did some research. And in Fighting Shadows, they talk about shadows in this sense. The shadow of despair, they say fight that with hope. Fight the shadow of loneliness with community. Fight the shadow of shame with vulnerability. Fight the shadow of lust with faithfulness. Fight the shadow of ambition with a kingdom vision. Fight the shadow of futility with calling. And fight the shadow of apathy with a cause. I would say that one of the things that we don't really consider today is that when we're deconstructing language through like the Sermon on the Mount, for example. Salvation is a community creating event. We have an epidemic of loneliness, though, in our society, especially with young men. We have a lack of vision in relationships. I read this morning, and I like the way that they put it. Again, language. That the reason, and I teach this in our online course, Relatable, for pre-marriage and marriage couples. We start out with lesson 1, having a vision for your marriage. You can have a vision for yourself as an individual, goals and things that you want to do in your life, purpose. You can have, each of you have a vision for who you are as a person, your identity. But when you come together, why are you coming together? What are you going to do that's together, that can only be done because the two of you are together? What is the purpose of your relationship? How are you going to work towards that goal? What is often somehow subliminally taught, if not directly said, again, through the use of some language, is for women to give up their goals and ambitions in support of their spouse, in support of their husbands. And so you have women going, well, I'm just here to be his helpmate. I'm going to help him achieve what God has put on his plate, for his vision. And that's not actually what we're talking about here. It's a vision that both of you are working towards because both of you feel that tug, that call, that spiritual tug from God to do. Not you go and create a backseat and you just help him do his thing. That happens, and the next thing you know, it's a scene from Waiting to Exhale, and you've got Angela Bassett setting all your stuff on fire in a car outside the front of your house because you're not being fulfilled as an individual. You're not fulfilling your calling because we're all created in the image of God. And we partner together. So there's that. Here's the thing, this study and the feedback, the way that they wrote it, what they say here is they said the feedback from the surveys was brutal. This is on page 154. So we're like 2/3 of the way through the book. And they're talking about apathy, the shadow of apathy. And they say the feedback from the survey was men today lack purpose and drive. Men today lack direction in life. Men today lack initiative in relationships. Men today lack a sense of vocational call. Lack. No initiative, no direction, no drive. The shadow of apathy is standing over a generation of men. And what's interesting is the next page, they talk about haphazard and detached, 2 words, language. We're deconstructing language to reconstruct our faith. Look at the words haphazard and detached. The authors here say, I don't think men see these changes as liberation from traditional masculine roles or a chance to party a bit more during extended adolescence. Most experience this like the loss of a pathway to a meaningful life. Men today deeply struggle to find direction and connection. And then they go on, and this is the part that I highlighted. In fact, I took a picture of it with my phone and shared it with one of my girlfriends. Most pastors I talk to today, this is the authors of the book quoting here, most pastors I talk to today say the same thing. Congregations are filled with wonderful, mature, thoughtful women who cannot, for the life of them, seem to find their equal among the men. It's not that they need a man to be successful. Most of them already are. Rather, they are seeking companionship from those whose maturity and vision track with their own. Now, I want to talk about the language of the word companionship because I think that's not enough there. It's not just companionship. You and a companion can go to the movies. A companion can be a pet. Companion can be your next door neighbor, and you sit on the front porch and have a glass of wine and chit chat and talk it up. Marriage, long-term relationships are about partnership. When we talk about language, reconstructing our faith around a theology of gender and relationships, what we're talking about is not just moving from companion or limiting ourselves to a companion for life, but it's partnership. I think I mentioned before there was an article last week that women over 60 were like, yeah, I'm not getting married again, or I'm not going to get remarried if I'm a widow or divorced or whatever. Or, you know what, women over 40 saying, hey, I'm good. I don't need to be married. Here's why. They're not able to find somebody who truly wants to partner. I had someone years ago, an older woman in our church, say, she will never get married again. She'd been married twice. And the last guy she divorced, not because there was anything particularly really wrong with him or that he did anything. It was because his health was failing and he wouldn't take care of himself. Like he wouldn't do the minimum. I know another person, a family member years ago, said the same thing about her husband. She was a lot younger at the time. She was like, he has an illness. He doesn't even want to do his part. You can't partner with somebody who's not willing to get on the field and play the game. And that's the challenge that a lot of women have. I remember dating a guy he had a college degree, but he was satisfied driving a truck for Coca-Cola, delivering Cokes to convenience stores. And I mean, that was fine. He was happy to do that. But he was like, all I want is to hang out, to do my job, hang out on the weekends with my friends, have a few beers, and really just that's it. And I was like, okay, then we are not meant for each other because you don't want to build nothing. You just want to sit there and tread water for the rest of your life. And I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. So the language we use, we have to think about how are we training our young men and our young women to expect and look for the partnership that we see with Priscilla and Aquila. The partnership we see in how Mary and Joseph came together to make sure that Jesus made it through his childhood, survived his childhood, when so many odds were against him. That's the kind of partnership we're looking for. Not just companionship, not just hanging out, but partnership. So it's a change in language. So in our next episode, I think I'm going to talk through or give you my commentary on what I'm seeing when I see couples sometimes have these marriage conversations that we get to witness, which I think is super valuable. So thank you so much for joining me today on No More Silos. My name is Erika, and I really appreciate you. Please, please, please rate this podcast on your podcast app. Give us 5 stars, 4 stars. Hey, I'll even take 3 if you can give me a comment as to what it is you don't like so I can improve. But thank you so much for listening. Check us out on Patreon. Check us out on social media. And like I said last time, I'm now on TikTok, which is an interesting place for this Gen Xer. Have a great rest of your day, and thanks for joining me.